The gas giant outside the window had no name that anyone agreed on. The station's official designation called it Perihelion Body 7 Amber, which the linguistics department had collectively decided was the kind of name produced by a committee that had never once looked out a window. Elia's ward called it Bernard, which was not official and not on any navigation chart but was, he maintained, far more appropriate for something that large and that indifferent to human opinion. Bernard hung in the dark, beyond the narrow research wing window, with his amber rings arranged around him like a very slow, very grand gesture of self-presentation. And Elias had stopped consciously seeing him approximately 3 years ago, which was exactly how long he had been on the Meridian Cultural Exchange Station, and exactly how long he had been failing to finish the translation that was either going to make his career or confirm every suspicion his former colleagues had about what happened to a man who turned down 2 chairs and a lunar fellowship to sit in a room with 4,000-year-old Valori tablets and a plant named Gerald. Gerald occupied the left corner of the desk nearest the window and had, over the course of 18 months, developed what Elias privately considered a passive-aggressive relationship with the grow light positioned above him. He leaned away from it. Not dramatically, not in any way that would register on any objective assessment of plant behavior, but with the particular quality of subtle and sustained withdrawal that Elias recognized from faculty meetings. He had documented this in his personal journal. He had also, on one occasion, apologized to Gerald, which he had not documented anywhere. The journal itself lived in a folder on the shared network drive between his terminal and Thesauri's, filed under the name EW Personal Notes Archive Ref MISC, which was not an inspired piece of concealment but which was, he believed, rendered impenetrable by the encryption layer he had built over its contents, a substitution cipher based on medieval astronomical notation, combined with a private symbol set he had invented at 14 and used, with what he now recognized in retrospect as frankly excessive confidence, ever since. He had never shared the key with anyone. The cipher had kept his graduate school diary safe from his roommate for 4 years. He saw no reason to doubt it. He was wrong about this, but he did not know that yet. And there is something to be said for the particular quality of peace available only to a man who does not know what he does not know. On the morning the story properly begins, Elias Ward was at peace. He had strong tea. He had Gerald. He had 3 competing translation models running on his terminal, each producing a different interpretation of the same 4-line inscription from the Valori 11th dynasty. And the 3 interpretations were mutually exclusive in ways that he found genuinely exciting, which said something about him as a person that he was content to leave unsaid. The door to the research office opened the way it always did when Thesauri arrived, not suddenly, not with any announcement, but with the quality of a room deciding it had been arranged incorrectly and correcting itself. She set her materials on the right side of the shared desk, with a precision Elias had once timed, involuntarily, and found consistent to within 3 seconds across every morning for 7 months. She placed her stylus parallel to the edge of the primary tablet tray. She produced, from the small thermal carry case that the station commissary had quietly begun stocking specifically, because she had requested it twice, a vessel of the dense, dark, almost syrup-textured tea that the Valori drank in serious working hours and that smelled, to Elias, like wood smoke and formal occasions. She looked at his screen. She looked at all 3 translation models. She said, without sitting down, "You have the aspectual suffix wrong in Model 2. It is rendering the verb as a continuous state when the root indicates completed action with ongoing consequence. They are not the same thing." Elias looked at Model 2, he looked at the root, he looked back at Model 2. "I had a reason for that," he said. "I am certain you did," Thesauri said and sat down. This was more or less a Tuesday. He fixed the suffix. The corrected Model 2 immediately produced a reading that aligned significantly better with the inscription's cultural context and rendered the other 2 models partially redundant, which he found irritating in the specific way. He always found it irritating when she was right, which was most of the time, which he had also documented in the journal under encryption, where it was safe. He told her the correction had improved the reading. She said she was glad to hear it. She said it in the careful, formally warm register they had settled into over 3 years, the one that felt, to Elias, like a room that had been made comfortable specifically for two people to work in. And he was grateful for it in a way that he also did not look at too directly, because looking at it directly was the kind of thing that ended comfortable rooms, and he had no interest in that. Bernard turned slowly outside the window. Gerald leaned away from his grow light. Elias opened the journal that no one could read and wrote, in the extinct ceremonial language of a civilization that had been silent for 4,000 years, the word for morning, and next to it, without quite meaning to, the word that in archaic Valori did not simply mean good. It had begun, as most things in Thessari's professional life began, with an index file. The shared archive index was a routine document, a cross-referenced catalog of the transliteration segments she and Elias had divided between them over the past quarter, updated weekly, entirely unremarkable. She had reached for it on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks into their collaboration, after Elias had left for the night with his bag over one shoulder, and a half-finished argument about vowel gradation still trailing behind him like something he intended to pick up in the morning. The office had gone quiet in the particular way it went quiet when he was not in it, which was not a quality of silence Thessari had anticipated noticing, and which she had filed carefully under observations requiring no further attention and moved on. She found the index. Adjacent to it, in the shared drive's unsorted overflow folder, where they both deposited documents they intended to organize later and never did, was a file named EW Personal Notes Archive Ref MISC. Thessari had reconstructed the phonemic system of a language spoken by a civilization that had been extinct for 600 years from a collection of incomplete stone fragments, a disputed translation of a secondary source, and what one of her colleagues had described as an unreasonable degree of stubbornness. She had done this in 11 months. The cipher inside EW Personal Notes Archive Ref MISC was, she would reflect later, more affectionate than challenging, the kind of puzzle that reveals in its construction a great deal about the person who built it. Medieval astronomical notation as the base substitution layer. A secondary symbol set of entirely private invention, consistent in its internal logic, creative in its application, and showing clear evidence of having been designed by someone who was 14 years old at the time and very pleased with themselves. She mapped the substitution logic in the first 20 minutes. She had the key in 40. She sat with the open document for a moment before reading it. This was, she acknowledged, a meaningful pause. She was aware that the ethical architecture of the situation had certain structural features she was obligated to examine before proceeding. She examined them. She was thorough. She was also, she conceded, a scholar of languages, which meant that an encoded document had engaged a part of her professional cognition that did not have an off switch. And the examination of ethical architecture, however sincere, was taking place in the same mind that had just spent 40 minutes doing the intellectual equivalent of a light warm-up. She made herself a second vessel of tea. She read. The first dozen entries were exactly what the file name suggested: research notes, translation observations, a recurring complaint about Model 3's handling of glottal stops that she agreed with and had been planning to raise herself. There was a section about Gerald that she read twice, not because it required rereading, but because Elias had apparently spent a paragraph and a half analyzing the plant's spatial behavior in terms of passive resistance theory. And the paragraph was simultaneously the most academically rigorous and most deeply unnecessary piece of writing she had encountered in 3 years of working with him, which was a distinction that, in this particular research wing, meant something. Then the entries changed. Not dramatically, not in any way that announced itself. The change was the kind a linguist recognized: a shift in register, a new proximity in the word choices, the slight syntactic loosening that happened when a person stopped writing for any imagined reader and began writing only for the page. He wrote about a conversation they had had in the third week, about the aspectual function of the velory conditional mood, and he had written it the way a person writes about a conversation when the conversation was not actually what they were thinking about. He wrote about her argument. He wrote about the way she had structured it. He wrote in a parenthetical aside that he had then crossed out in plain text and rewritten twice before apparently settling on a version that satisfied him, that she had a quality of precision that he found. And here he had deployed 3 consecutive qualifying clauses, each one pulling back slightly from the last, before finally landing on professionally remarkable. She read this entry 3 times. Then she read the entries from 6 months prior and set her tea down. He had been learning the deep bond register. That was, taken at face value, academically reasonable. The deep bond language was present in the archive texts, and any serious scholar of the velory precontact period would eventually need to engage with its grammar. What was less academically routine was that he had been practicing its conjugations with a specific and consistent subject. The verb forms he drilled were not abstract exercises. They had a referent. The entries were annotated, careful, corrected in the margins with the same scrupulous attention he brought to all his translation work. And they said, in the extinct ceremonial language of her species' most sacred bond tradition, said it in the continuous intentional, said it in the witness declarative, said it twice in the absolute, things that the deep bond register did not allow one to say casually, because the register itself was not built for casual use. It was built for one purpose. Every velory child learned this before they learned to read. The bioluminescent layer beneath her cheekbones pulsed amber in the empty office. She sat with it. She was very still in the way she was still when a text had just reorganized everything she thought she understood about a civilization. That particular quality of internal rearrangement that felt, from the inside, less like discovery and more like recognition. She thought about the 14-year-old who had built the cipher. She thought about the man who had been practicing devotion in a dead language for 6 months and annotating his own conjugations for accuracy. She closed the file. She retrieved the archive index. She worked for the remainder of the evening in a focused and unremarkable silence, and when Elias arrived the following morning with 2 teas and an unresolved question about vowel gradation, she answered the question, and he sat down. And Bernard turned outside the window, and Gerald leaned away from his light, and nothing, on the surface of that office, had changed in any way that a person not paying close attention would have noticed. Thesari was paying very close attention to quite a lot of things. 3 weeks is not a long time in the context of a civilization that had been silent for 4,000 years. Thesari understood this. She was, by both training and temperament, a person who could hold a question for as long as the question required holding, and she had done so with questions that had occupied entire years of her life without resolution and without any particular distress. She was good at waiting. She was considerably less practiced at waiting for something that pulsed amber against her own composure every time she looked up from her work and found Elias Ward on the other side of the desk, annotating a transliteration segment with the particular focused intensity of a man who had absolutely no idea that someone had read his diary. This was, she acknowledged, a situation with no established academic protocol. She researched it anyway. This was her method, the same approach she brought to a disputed inscription or a contested phonemic shift, applied now to the question of what one did when a colleague had been practicing the second irrevocable tense in your species' most sacred ceremonial language while believing himself to be doing homework. She pulled the archive texts on deep bond law. She cross-referenced the conjugation tables with their cultural legal annotations. She built a table, privately, on her personal terminal, and what the table confirmed was both more and less alarming than she had allowed herself to fully register on first reading. The deep bond register was not a language of feeling. This was the misunderstanding most off-world scholars brought to it, and she had spent a portion of her early career gently correcting the assumption in peer review. It was a language of acts. Its verb forms did not describe states of emotion. They performed legal and ceremonial functions, each tense a different category of commitment, each mood a different threshold of public declaration. When Elias had conjugated in the continuous intentional, he had, in the technical framework of pre-contact veillori civil tradition, initiated a formal declaration of intent. When he had used the witness declarative, he had, despite the complete absence of witnesses, which created an interesting jurisprudential question she noted in the margin of her private table, escalated the declaration to community-registered status. When he had used the absolute twice, he had completed the primary sequence of a formal bond proposal, and the second irrevocable tense, which appeared once, at the bottom of an entry timestamped at 2:14 in the morning following a translation breakthrough, and which she had reread 4 times to confirm she was parsing it correctly, had not been used in any surviving text since the early Third Dynasty. It translated, in the closest functional equivalent available in any language Thesari currently spoke, as a promise made across every future existence, with the specific grammatical weight that indicated the speaker understood the scope and intended it without qualification. He had written this. He had then written, in plain text beneath it, check aspectual source, possible overcorrection. He had corrected the tense in the following entry and moved on. She put her head in her hands for a moment, alone in the office during the midday break, which was not her habit, and then she sat up and made more tea because some situations required tea, and this was aggressively one of them. Elias, 3 meters away across the research wing atrium, was having what he would have described as an extremely productive week. The major translation segment had resolved in a way that confirmed his third model's core structural argument, and partially vindicated a position he had been defending in correspondence with a senior archivist on the home station for 8 months. He had sent a brief and carefully understated message about this. He had also told Gerald. Gerald had continued his program of withdrawal from the grow light, undeterred, and Elias had written in the journal that Gerald represented a model of academic conviction he found aspirational. He had also begun, for reasons he was not examining, spending his midday breaks in the station's preserved veillori garden. The garden was attached to the research wing by a short corridor that Elias had walked past for 3 years without entering, because it was designated as a cultural consultation space for veillori station personnel, and he had always assumed, without checking, that this designation implied a restriction. He had, on a Tuesday, finally checked. There was no restriction. Anyone could use the garden. It had a bench and good light, and preserved veillori plant life that maintained its own dim bioluminescent rhythm independent of the station's artificial day cycle. He had gone in, sat on the bench, and spent 40 minutes sketching the plants in the margin of a working notebook while thinking, with great focus and deliberateness, about a phonemic shift. He named 2 of the plants. The larger one, which had broad leaves that curved slightly toward the central pathway, he named elision, after the phonemic process at the center of his current argument with Thesari. The smaller one he named compensatory lengthening, which Thesari was arguing was the more significant feature, and which the plant, being smaller, he found fitting. He did not think about Thesari while assigning these names. He was very thorough about not thinking about her. He returned to the office afterward and wrote 3 paragraphs of translation notes and 1 paragraph of journal entry in a dead language, and none of it was about plants. On the 3rd Thursday of these 3 weeks, at the end of an afternoon that had proceeded exactly as all their afternoons proceeded, Thesari gathered her materials with her customary precision, and then paused, which was not customary. She told him she would be in the garden the following morning at 7. She said she would value his company if he had no other obligation. She said it in their professional register, in the careful, formally warm tone of 3 years of mutually respected distance, and she looked at him with her silver-gold eyes in the late office light while she waited for his answer. Elias said he had no other obligation. Then he said it again. Then he said it a third time with a subordinate clause attached to it that added no new information whatsoever. Thessari collected the last of her materials and left, and the bioluminescent layer beneath her cheekbones was doing something that the office light was too bright for him to see, and which he was not looking for, and which had the color, in the Valori visual tradition, of a word he had been conjugating in secret for 6 months. He opened the journal. He wrote in the dead language of her people, in the present tense, about the quality of a pause that lasted 4 seconds, and he did not notice, or did not let himself notice, that he had stopped annotating his conjugations for accuracy 3 weeks ago. Elias arrived at the garden at 6:47, which was 13 minutes early, which he attributed entirely to the coffee, and not at all to the fact that he had been awake since 4, and had spent the intervening hours lying in the particular way a person lies when they are pretending, with diminishing conviction, to be asleep. He had dressed with what he told himself was his normal level of attention, and what was, in fact, the result of 3 separate decisions and 1 consultation with his reflection that he was never going to document anywhere. He had his notebook. He had no particular reason for the notebook. He held it anyway, because a man with a notebook is a man who is there for professional reasons, and he was committed, even now, to the architecture of plausible deniability. The garden received him in its own ambient light, the bioluminescent rhythm of the preserved plants running on their own internal calendar, indifferent to the station's artificial dawn. He sat on the bench. He opened the notebook to a page that already had elision and compensatory lengthening sketched in the margin from a previous visit, and he looked at them, and he thought that naming plants after a phonemic argument was perhaps the most Elias Ward thing he had ever done, and that this was either charming or a clinical indicator of something, and that this was not the morning to resolve that particular question. Thessari arrived at 7. Of course she did. She was wearing the long pale overrobe, and he noticed it, and this time he let himself notice that he was noticing it, which was new, and which produced in his chest a sensation he had been cataloging in a dead language for 6 months, as though careful notation could keep it at a safe academic distance. She sat beside him, not across from him. There was no desk here, no professional geometry to default to, and for a moment they were simply 2 people in a garden at 7 in the morning, with the soft, irregular light of living things moving around them, and the gas giant beyond the station's outer panels doing what Bernard always did, which was turning, slowly, in the manner of something that had been doing this since long before anyone arrived to watch, and intended to continue long after. They talked about the garden first. This was, Elias would think later, an act of mutual kindness, the allowing of an ordinary beginning before an extraordinary middle. Thessari had noted that the Valori plan on the eastern side of the path was exhibiting a growth pattern consistent with its native seasonal calendar, despite being 4 light years from the climate that calendar was built for. She found this, she said, quietly remarkable. Elias said he found it also remarkable, and they agreed on this, and it was the easiest agreement they had reached in 3 years, which should perhaps have told him something about the quality of what was coming. But Elias had never been a man who read the weather until it was already in the room. He told her about the translation segment. She said she had read his preliminary notes and that the aspectual argument was strong, and then she paused and said that the footnote in section 3 had made her laugh, which he had not expected, and which caused something to happen to his face that he was glad she appeared to be looking at the plants for rather than at him. He asked what specifically she had found funny. She said the footnote had described Model 3's structural limitations, using a metaphor involving a confused migratory animal, and that she had found it, in her precise phrasing, both scientifically inaccurate and emotionally resonant, and that this combination was one she had come to associate specifically with his written voice, and that she had spent considerable time, over 3 years, finding it, and here she produced a pause of the kind she used when selecting a word with care: irreplaceable. Elias looked at her. She turned to face him directly, the way she had in the office on Thursday, the way that did not belong to their professional register, and she spoke. The deep bond language came out of her the way a river comes out of a source, not dramatically, not with announcement, but as something that had always been moving and had now simply become visible. The archaic register was not a performance. It was not quotation. She was not a scholar citing a text. She was a speaker choosing her words from a tradition 4,000 years deep, and the question she asked, whether the words he had written in that register were meant, or whether he had only been studying grammar, arrived with the full ceremonial weight of every conjugation she had ever decoded from his journal, every entry she had read in the quiet of the office with the light moving across her face, and Bernard turning his slow, indifferent circles outside. Elias did not move. He was aware, in this stillness, of several things arriving simultaneously in the manner of passengers who had all booked the same seat. That she had read the journal, that the cipher had lasted approximately 40 minutes against a woman who reconstructed dead civilizations from incomplete evidence, that she had therefore read the entry about Gerald and the passive resistance theory, that she had read the second irrevocable tense, and the note he had written beneath it questioning his own aspectual source, that she had been sitting across from him for 3 weeks with all of this knowledge and a cup of tea, and had continued to be right about the phonemic shift, which now struck him as almost unreasonable. He breathed. He breathed again. He looked at her, and her bioluminescence was visible now in the garden's soft light, running amber and warm beneath her cheekbones, and he understood that her use of the ceremonial register was not a question in the way a stranger asks a question. It was a question in the way a door held open is a question. She already knew. She had known for 3 weeks. She was giving him, with the formal precision of someone who understood exactly what she was offering, one chance to walk through it on his own. He thought briefly, and with the detached clarity available only to a man in free fall, that he had spent 3 years encoding himself in dead languages and encrypted files, and the names of plants, and that all of it, every footnoted feeling, every careful conjugation, every annotation he had written in the absolute declarative and then cross-referenced for accuracy, had been perfectly, completely legible to the one person it concerned, and had been for months, and she was here anyway, in the garden her species used for serious conversations, in the robe she wore for formal occasions, asking him if he meant it. He closed the notebook. He set it on the bench beside him. He did not pick it up again. He answered her in velour, not in the archaic ceremonial depth, not in the extinct register of practiced conjugations and private grammar exercises, but in the living language, in the present tense, in the register that her people used not for sacred declarations or legal proceedings, but for the simple and irreducible act of saying a true thing to another person plainly. His pronunciation was imperfect. She had been correcting it with great structural elegance for 3 years. She did not correct it now. She listened to him say what he said, and the bioluminescence moved across her face in a pattern that the archive texts would have recognized, and that Elias, who had read every archive text available, recognized also, and he was still not entirely breathing normally, but he found, somewhat to his surprise, that this did not seem to matter. Bernard turned outside the station's panels, indifferent and immense, the way he had been turning since before any of this and would continue turning after. Gerald, back in the office, leaned away from his grow light with the quiet conviction of something that had already made its position clear and saw no